Hey guys, this message is entitled Moving Past the Enemy, Canceling Satan's Plan from Our Life and Fulfilling God's Plan. And you see the picture of a chessboard because there is a game of chess that's being played, but for anyone who chooses to follow Christ, the victory is assured. So I want to ask us, each of us, who writes the script for how you think and live your life? And if you don't think that there's a script, if you think it's all chance and it all gets invented at the moment, that it's all totally spontaneous, I'm afraid that you might be deceived a little bit because there's actually quite a bit. I don't mean that's predetermined, but what I mean is we fall into a script rather easily that has already been written. And there are different scripts that are competing for our attention that we can choose. It's a good thing we have a good agent that gets us good scripts. But the devil has a script for us, and our past writes a script for us, and that there's things that quite a bit that overlaps between those two things. All around us, the world is competing to give us scripts, so we'll buy products, so that we'll buy into a philosophy, so that we'll go down a path that somebody wants us to go down. The media is trying to charm us into following a path. And we have our own plans. We have our own ambitions. We have things that we strive for. And somewhere in there are things that God has written for us. And the question will be, over and over again in our lives, what script will we choose? What voice will we hear? What will we step into? Our enemy's purpose is to get us to follow scripts that seem true based upon what the world says, what our experience is, but those scripts don't take God into account. But God himself, he says concerning the script that he has written for us, he knows what he's planned for us. And his plan, it's all to grow us up. It's all to build us up. It's all to lift us up. It's to prosper us. And it's never to harm us. Did we ever come to harm? Yes, we do, because there are other scripts that are put in our path. And God has a plan. He has a hope for us. He has a future, a destiny that he's written. And I found out quite a long time ago and was reminded of it recently that when God writes a script, even if we agree with the script, that's no guarantee that it happens. There's contention. Once upon a time, Darlene was considered for a position in a church, and we knew from Revelation that God wanted that to happen. But somebody got in the way of that, and we didn't know how to overcome that. I don't even know that we missed anything in it. God may even have allowed that to happen so that we would know that it's not guaranteed, that it's still up to the people of God. Now, Jesus did say, whatever we bind on earth is bound in heaven, whatever we loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And he said that was a key to the kingdom. So, things we declare, like we were declaring just a little bit ago, make a difference for what we actually can accomplish and walk in. Now, the entire story of faith is about choosing a script, choosing to walk in a script, welcoming the script that God has for us instead of the ones that we may have learned or that are presented to us that we might be overcome by. So you see, the worldly script sometimes tells us things often tells us things that we're powerless. Who do we think we are? We're unimportant. Do I really think that God has assignments for me? Who do I think I am? Life is random. And one of the random things that happens is at some point along the way we die, and we don't have a choice about that. Now there's some truth to that, but life is not random. And we think that sickness, for example, but many other things as well, that there's only limited options. We got to choose the right stuff. If we don't make the right choices for ourselves, then who knows what's going to happen to us. We may get sick. We may not recover. And it's not something we have any control about. Also, we believe that if we're going through any trouble at all, it must be because we're doing something wrong. So if I'm having any pain, if my family is having troubles, if there's any struggle, then I must have sinned. That was believed from ancient times, but Jesus kind of said that was a lie. His script for us is that really there's no limit to what we can do. We can do everything, any assignment that he has for us, anything he puts in our path, we can do even when we don't think we can, because we're not doing it by ourselves. We do it with Christ who lives in us, and he's all around us. When we pray, that changes the circumstances. And God has foreordained works, things that we're to walk in. So he has assignments just for me, just for you. And everything that God puts on our path, even things that look like we may struggle to accomplish, in the process of that struggle, as we pray and we reach out to him, and as we seek to fulfill the script that was written just for us, then he is going to grow us up. He's going to prosper us. And even when we fail, even when we fall, even when difficult things happen, even when we remember the things that happened in our childhood, God can take even those things, bring comfort to them, and cause us to be compassionate. He will grow us up so that even the bad things that have happened actually work out for our good. And it's not true that if I have any troubles, that means I did something wrong, because the word itself says many of the afflictions, the trials, the difficulties of even righteous people, but God actually has a way of delivering us out of each one of those things. It's an occasion for prayer. I don't like that I seem more often to go to God when I'm going through difficulties, but I like the result of that because I learned to lean on him. So I'd like to talk about a couple of stories that kind of bring into relief the kinds of scripts that we have as choices. Probably we're very familiar with these stories, although one of the stories is going to be my story, and I'm familiar with it, but you may not be as much. But let's talk about Gideon, and his story is shown in Judges 3 chapters 6, 7, and 8. And it's a really neat encounter. I was going to have us actually read it, but to me, it's a little complicated to go back and forth between showing you that scripture and showing you the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to tell the story, but I also know that you probably know the story. I'm going to remind you of it. So an angel from God comes before Gideon, and this during a time when Israel is kind of surrounded by its enemies. But we just sang a song about what happens when we're surrounded. Turns out that God's surrounding us gives us power even over our enemies that may look like they have surrounded us and have the upper hand. And when the angel of God comes before Gideon, Gideon is hiding. And most of Israel is hiding from the Midianites. And the angel says to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And Gideon's feeling is like he does a double take and looks around to see who the angel might be talking to other than him, because he feels he doesn't feel anything like being a mighty warrior. And actually he's kind of fresh with the angel. He says, "You say, mighty warrior, but the Lord's abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. I don't feel mighty at all, and I don't think anybody in Israel is mighty." And with a little bit more discussion, the angel reveals the assignment that God has for Gideon. And really, it's like some New Testament stories we know too, and some stories that you are part of in your own life. He doesn't believe it when an assignment is being given to him because he knows he's not capable of carrying out this assignment. He feels like it's a case of mistaken identity. He just doesn't know what his identity is with God. And God says to him through the angel, "Save Israel out of Midian's hand. I'm sending you." And contained in "I am sending you" is, I am going to give you the strength. I'm going to give you the plan. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make it possible for you to do what you know you can't do. Mm-hmm. Because when you get assignments, it's not you, it's you plus God. And as Bill Johnson says, you plus God is majority, no matter who you is. Gideon's still not convinced. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. But as the angel talks to him, God then gives him some lesser assignments. First, that Gideon might make a sacrifice before God, because at the very least, Gideon knows he's been chosen to experience God through this angelic encounter. And so when he makes the sacrifice, God actually comes in fire and consumes the sacrifice. That's a very powerful thing, supernatural. The supernatural element of it begins to convince Gideon that God is going to use him. But he still is fearful, doesn't see how it's all going to work. And so he asks for one sign after another. This is where putting out a fleece, that idea first came. Where putting out a fleece means asking God to show a sign that proves that he's at work. So he does several of those. And but then there's a sign where Gideon begins to get changed by it. And that is, he's given the assignment to tear down the idol that his father has erected, an idol to Baal, and the Asherah pole that's right next to it. And this is why Israel is having trouble, because they have followed a script of worshiping other gods. They become like the people that surround them. And so Gideon does this thing. He doesn't do it in the daylight. He does it at night, so nobody will discover him. But when the Baal is burned and all this is going on, some people are outraged because they think that, first of all, something not politically correct was done, and they're afraid they're going to pay a penalty for it. And then it's revealed somebody saw Gideon doing this, and they want him to be killed for doing that. But his father defends him. So Gideon did something for God, but God's scenario, his script for Gideon is that this is taking Gideon in deeper into following God's ways. And as he does this, all of a sudden Gideon gets energy, and the next thing that happens in the story is that the enemy starts gathering against him. And Gideon, it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Why does the Spirit of God come on him? Because Gideon began to be obedient to God, and that draws the Spirit to come. And when the Spirit of God comes on Gideon, he calls on the people, and they respond to him, and the army forms around his leadership. And even with all that, Gideon's afraid of failure. There's many other parts of the story where God whittles down the army that's going to fight for Israel, because he wants people to know that it's God himself that's done the rescuing, that has given them this script that when they fulfill it, brings them to the right place in God. And now God says, I want you to come down upon the enemy's camp. But Gideon's looking at the enemy's camp, and it looks like about 100 times the size of his camp. So how could that possibly succeed? But God says to him through the angel, they are terribly afraid of you, Gideon, which he doesn't believe. But he says, God says through the angel, go down to the enemy's camp in disguise and listen. And he does that. He goes down there and he overhears two enemy soldiers talking to each other. One had a dream, and in the dream, Gideon, something associated with Gideon is happening. The other one interprets it and says, this surely means that God is with Gideon and that he will defeat us. So Gideon hears that, and he knows that what God has told him is true. And then he almost acts fearlessly after that. One aspect after another, he is now fully involved in God's script, and he begins to believe that what God says to him is reliable, and that as he walks, God will back him up. And he succeeds. But it's not important just that he succeeded. What's important is that his self-concept changed as a result of fulfilling God's script for him. So there's so much more in that story, and it's very worth reading. And I want to move to another story and another set of scripts. This one you're probably even more familiar with, the story of Lazarus's death, and the script that God had already written for Jesus. And actually, it's well worth saying right here that Jesus, the amazing thing is, he seems to not doubt, or hardly ever doubt, his Father's script for him. He knows that the Father is totally reliable, and he's so sold out to the Father that he knows that even if the Father's plan will result in his death, he has nothing to worry about. That the Father's plan will always result in a good outcome for him or for anybody on whose behalf he is acting. But we don't know that. So we could be in a boat and it feels like the boat's going to be overwhelmed. Jesus is totally assured, not worried at all, because Father's given him his orders. He knows that Father will bring him where he needs to go, and that has given him authority even over the evil himself. We don't know that, though. And so in those same conditions, we have a lot more fear, a lot more doubt. And I don't want anybody to think, as we're talking about all this, that this is all about that we always have to have faith. Yes, God wants us always to have faith. But if we ever lack faith, then that's when we call on him. God knows that life is hard on planet Earth. He knows that we're going to be sifted by our enemy. He knows that death is stalking us. He knows that there's going to be a coronavirus. He knows all the things that we're going to encounter, and he's not putting us down for the doubts that we have. He will give us many chances, just like he gave Gideon. Jesus doesn't need those chances, but Jesus, also God, gives people chances too. So in this story, as you know, Lazarus has two sisters, Mary and Martha, and Jesus used to stay at their house when he came to Jerusalem. They became good friends. Now he's on the road, Jesus is, with the disciples, and there's word sent from the sisters, from Mary and Martha, Lazarus is sick, come quickly. It doesn't say, so he won't die, but that's obviously implied. Jesus doesn't come. He hangs around longer where he is, and he says to his disciples, who hear him read the little letter that was sent, my Father is telling me there's going to be a good outcome. This isn't going to result in death. Oh, well, that's a relief to everybody. And then sometime later, he says to them, but we're going back now anyhow. Even though some days have gone past, we're going to go back. And they say, well, why do we need to go back? And he says, well, I need to wake up Lazarus. And they say, well, that's good then, because he must be okay if he's fallen asleep. And Jesus says, well, what I meant is he died. And I'm glad that we weren't there to rescue him, because if we were there, we would have rescued him. But something greater is going to happen. Well, nobody even knows what he's talking about. And they go back, even though they're afraid, even though the disciples are afraid that the Jews will kill them because of all the things that they've been doing that are powerful and threaten the powers that be. And as they come back, Jesus encounters first Martha and then Mary, and both of them give him a hard time. If you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. Yet even after they give him a hard time, they're willing to say, but even now, your Father would listen to you. I don't think they even know exactly what they're asking of him. They still have hope, and they have hope because of him. And Jesus says, don't you know that your brother will rise again? And Martha says, well, I know, and I believe that there's a resurrection coming. But that's not right now, is it? The resurrection isn't for now. So what do I do about now? And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. So he's basically saying, just hang with me and you'll see it all. And by the way, God has said that through prophets and through our own personal words to Darlene and I, you'll see it all. And we have our doubts what he means. And yet I'm expecting to see it all. I'm expecting to see people raised from the dead. I'm expecting to see amazing healings. I'm afraid they won't happen, but even though I have unbelief, help my unbelief. And I think those words of God will be fulfilled in our life. So Mary and Martha hang with Jesus. Jesus says, take me to the grave. And it's obvious that he's about to open up the grave and he's going to do something. But Martha says, it's going to stink, Lord, because it's been 4 days. And the belief was that within 4 days, anybody would begin to experience corruption, and there would be decomposition and a stink that came from that. And Jesus' answer to that is, didn't I say that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God? And then they open the tomb, and Jesus cries out, Lazarus, come out. And we know what happens. Lazarus comes out. There's no stink of death on him. If he had a sickness, and apparently he did, He doesn't have it anymore. So he's not just been raised from the dead, he was healed of the sickness as well. It's no longer in his body. And he's restored to his sisters. Not only that, but many people come to a trusting belief in Jesus as a result of this resurrection. And it's a powerful, powerful story. So there was the scripts that any one of us probably would have believed, just like Martha and Mary did. It would have been hard to believe anything else. If you've never seen somebody raised from the dead, even though there were stories in Israel's history of Elijah and Elisha both raised people from the dead. But how often did it happen? Not very often. And Jesus was bringing the totally new upon the scene. And that means you got to change the way you think about things. And he gives us scripts. He gives us whole scenarios to walk out, that when we walk those things out in obedience, and sometimes only partial obedience, he will fulfill things and change our attitude. He'll grow us. He'll change our very nature. Okay. There's a couple of Bible stories, and any one of you could tell a story right here, but I'll just tell a little bit of my story. I guess if I had enough faith, I would just pick out somebody at random and ask you to tell a story, and maybe you'll get to do that in a few minutes. So this story, I'm sure that I could think of a dozen stories to tell you in my life that would each illustrate different aspects of this thing, where I had my script that I believed, and God was interacting with me and giving me an opportunity. And in that opportunity, I was faint of heart. I may have started out strong, or I may have started out weak, but somewhere along the way, I had doubt. And God had mercy on me and changed me as a result of walking out his script. And every time that I started to walk out my own script, or the devil's script, or the world's script, God had an answer for that. He's pretty good that way. He knows how to get us on our path back where we need to be. So this starts, I certainly knew Taffy and Jim from Shore Vineyard that are with us today. But I didn't tell them about this immediately when it began to happen, which was about 8 years ago, that I began to hear from God that he wanted to move us back to Washington, D.C., where we had been little over 20 years ago. And we were in the midst of many different aspects of a major assignment in New Jersey, a lot of which we shared with Jim and Taffy. And so during the time when I was hearing this, I had my doubts. Darlene had her doubts when I told her about it. And first, I kept on looking for things that God might do that would going to draw us back. Then I was so hungry to have God's word fulfilled in our life that I started trying to make it happen. God did say there was an important assignment for us, but he didn't even say what the assignment was. And so I had to guess, but you know how it is when you're guessing. It's a little bit like just before Christmas, and you see presents hidden in the closet when you're a kid, and you're guessing about what's in them. In fact, you might even try to take a peek to see. But all my peeking and all my trying didn't actually get me any closer to knowing what this assignment was and how it was going to happen. And then finally, one day, our son Peter called and he said, "Dad, I've got a plan. I know you want to come back here, and I found this piece of property that has 2 houses on it. I want you and Mom and Granny, my mother, to come and live next door to us. And I am not going to give up my current job, but I'm going to take on a new, I'm going to build tiny houses, and I have a goal for them that eventually I want to do something that's going to benefit families with autistic children as they get older and they need more independence. I think tiny houses may be the solution for that. And I want you to help me. And okay, here's where I'm honest and say, I didn't really want to do that. I had dreams of ministry assignments, and they didn't involve tiny houses. And I was scared of the assignment, to be honest, because I don't know much about building. I don't know much about real estate, and I'm terrible with a hammer. I'm pretty good at hitting my thumb with it, but not so much when it comes to building things. Some of you are very good at that kind of thing, but not me. So I was scared of that assignment. But God said, when you do this, not only will you be helping Pete's family and 4 of your grandchildren, but your mom's going to get taken care of during this time too. Mom was like 96 at the time, so we could use some help taking care of her. And it was going to be Pete and me working together. I knew that was a good thing. So in spite of every obstacle, we managed to move 2 households. It was hard leaving Shore Vineyard back in New Jersey and leaving all of our many friends and coming back to Washington. But we came, and it was hard. My mom actually had a stroke like the week before we moved. I didn't even see how we were going to manage to move her, but God made it all happen. And Julie, our daughter-in-law, was a tremendous help with Mom. So I was beginning to see God's script come true and to have benefits that I hadn't anticipated. And still, I felt confusion and didn't see how things were going to work out. But tell me, I bet you all can identify with me in this. Eventually, we started getting to go back to church again, even though Mom required a lot of our attention. And Pete actually had a suggestion. So we ended up at L3 Church, which was, somewhat Pentecostal, and seemed like it was a good place for us. And we began to believe that that would be a place where we could make a contribution. And in fact, we had times with Eric, the lead pastor, and he thought so too. He thought that we'd be able to help. But even that, which actually was part of God's script, wasn't as easy to happen as we thought it was going to be, because Eric and his associate pastor both left, and you would think that would leave the way open for us, but they decided that they were going to do a search to find a pastor to lead the church. But they hired us to be staff pastors to help the congregation during the year of transition. And that was a very good thing for us. We loved the opportunity of serving that church, but it was a limited gig. And they explained to us that when a new pastor was called, there probably wasn't going to be money in the budget for us to be on the staff at the same time. So that after a year, we probably would be out of a job. And we didn't just see it as a job, it was a ministry opportunity. So we didn't know what was going to happen. And eventually that did happen. Eventually they called a pastor, and that pastor came, and we didn't know what was going to happen next, but all of a sudden God began to speak to me, and he told me something that was totally unexpected, which was, I want you to start a church, and it's going to be a vineyard church. And he began to tell us things about it. Understand, both of us were already in our 70s at this point, and the years leading up to this had taken a little bit of a toll. And so there were times when I felt every inch of 72 when we started the church, and I wasn't sure. And I had never led a church. Darlene had, but it was going to be new for me. And it seemed like a difficult assignment. You sure about this, God? But he called it Wonder Church. So it was starting with a wonder. I wondered how we were going to do it. But we began to walk it out, and that's where you guys came into the story. You became part of our story. Actually, many of you already were. We knew you at L3. So you knew 2 legs of this script. And we don't know all of the script yet because we haven't all fully walked it out. But a church began to get created. And it's enough different from the average church that it at least has that characteristic. It's interesting to see how this church will work, has worked. A church that people can, right after worship, begin to make declarations like you guys did today. And then a year into it, coronavirus hits. And that makes it even seem more ridiculous for a church to succeed. And yet, God is not confused. God is not surprised. God has a script. God has a scenario. He has a plan. This was actually already written in a spiritual book that's kept in heaven, that has our names on it. And it's not that it has every single step written in it, but at least I don't think so. But the main aspects of it are written. And God has a plan for us to walk out. And the job is challenging, but very satisfying. Why can I believe that it's going to work out even when we have trials and difficulties? Because it's God's church. And Darlene's reminding me of that all the time. When I get a little wimpy, a little weepy, a little concerned, she'll say, "Isn't it Jesus' church? Doesn't he have to handle that?" I say, "Yeah, but I have to act like I know what it is." and we're all in that together, you guys. I've never thought that this was Darlene's and my assignment alone. It's something where he's given an assignment to a people. We may have heard about it first, but you guys signed on. We were in Nigeria several years back, and actually in an upper room in the church, after having ministered that day in the church, and we were having refreshments, and there was a lady there that I'd been introduced to, and I knew she had a word for me. God told me. She didn't tell me. And she sought me out just before it was time to go back to our hotel, and she began to prophesy to me. And what she said was, "The full task I have assigned you is immense." And I thought, oh. And she said, "That's why I, God, have given you a long and healthy life, because you'll need all of that to do all that I've called you to." And I'm telling you guys, I'm sometimes scared to tell you all the things that God has shown me that we're to walk in, because I don't want you guys to freak. Because I get freaked by it, and I worry about, am I making it up? But up till now in my life, I don't think I have made it up. God has fulfilled the things that he's assigned to us. And we're in this story together. So off of my story, even though it's hanging there, it's not complete, long ways to go yet. And but it's exciting. It's exciting to serve the living God, even though we fail sometimes, even though we fall on our face sometimes, even though we have doubts sometimes. In every single circumstance that we go through, there's an interplay. The world's there, our flesh is there, enemy is there, using our flesh and the world to distract us, to take us down blind alleys, to mess us up. But God's there. And God even allows us to be tested, because without testing, there's not growth. Or as somebody once said, without a test, there's no testimony. We may be surrounded by difficulty. We may be surrounded and feel like we're surrounded by an enemy. We may feel like it's beyond our strength, but and the enemy will attack us with fear and remind us of times when we failed. We may believe the lies for a time of a negative destiny. I mean, after all, fear is just faith in the wrong destiny for us. But God, over and over again, reminds us of his plan and his promises to give us his favor. When we follow him, like Gideon, we're amazed at our own success. And even though when we succeed, we still get distracted and fearful again. But God is not dismayed that happens to us. He understands the weakness of our flesh, and he will rescue us over and over again and build our trust and allow our hope to increase, and even begin to give us confidence, not in our own flesh, but confidence in ourselves being able to follow God. And he's there to catch us, even when the worst happens. His promise is that even if we die, he's the resurrection. And he says, actually, we'll never even experience death. Once we have chosen to follow him, we will go from life to life at the end of this life that we're living. He knows that the enemy is asked to sift us. The reason God allows us to be sifted, tested, that is because God's going to use it for our growth. The enemy always has a plan to unseat us from sitting in God's plan. But at the same time, the enemy intends things for evil. God intends them for good. And he says to Simon Peter, he said, you're going to have a failure, and it's going to be very soon. But even though you have a failure, I prayed for you so that you'll be strengthened, so that your faith will still be there in spite of that failure. And when you've turned back, you're going to have a major role in leading the band of believers. And that's exactly what happened. And he tells us to be strong and courageous because God is the one that's going with us. He says, my grace is sufficient. Even to the point where Paul said he even welcomes his failures, welcomes his weakness, because he's found out that every time he gets messed up, God makes things better and even uses his mess ups. There's a saying that used to be said a lot, I can't win for losing, people would say. But when we follow the Lord, we can't lose for winning. Every time we lose, he's going to use it for our winning. Even Jesus needed to be strengthened and rescued by his Father. His resurrection didn't happen by his exerting himself when he was dead. The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead, that Spirit lives inside of us. And we have a partnership with God. We will not lose. I don't want to get into this, but there could be a whole other sermon that these principles don't apply only to individuals, but groups. Whether it's our family, our church, our ethnic group that we're part of, a nation. God has a plan to rescue us, to deliver us, to use us corporately, and we can count on him. When I first started thinking about this sermon 2 weeks ago, because of an early morning conversation between Darlene and I can't remember which one of us was having a bit of a meltdown, but in our conversation, we began to focus on God, and I saw the possibility of preaching this. I saw this picture of a chessboard, and so then I remembered this rule in chess. The rule is called a pawn capturing another pawn en passant, which means in passing. And I don't want to get in very much into what it means, but it's shown in this picture that when your forces have advanced, an enemy will try to harass you by sending out his own forces. So if a pawn moves 2 spaces as an opening move towards you, ends up adjacent to you, there's a rule that allows you to capture that pawn by going behind him. And not worried about why they ever invented this rule in chess and why it's such a obscure rule that I'm bringing up. But remember that God has gambits available to us. He intends for us to surprise the enemy by going behind him as the enemy advances against us, and we take over. We go into the enemy's camp and take back what he stole from us. He's under our feet. God has prepared for us to walk in victory. And as I was searching for things associated with this message, I came upon this tweet, and I love it. It says, "I love how you pray for something, and it seemingly goes unanswered, but then one day, all of a sudden, you're at the center of the very thing that once felt impossible." And how many times has that happened to us? We gave up, even in some cases, and yet all of a sudden, there we are, and God has restored our hope. And the thing that we couldn't even see how it could happen, happens. But I love this. She says, the waiting room isn't punishment. God was positioning you to receive the fullness of your request. Stay in position. It's a good word. Okay. We had plenty of time, but somehow I've managed to use a good bit of it. But I'd like for us to take 10 minutes in groups